Okay, so first of all, who are you?
I'm Stephen Hodder, chairman of Hodder Partners, architects here in Manchester, and also next president of the Royal Institute of British Architects.
Why did you study architecture?
I'm not sure. I think it was certainly the case with me that as an 18-year-old I really quite understood why I decided to study architecture. I had an all-round capability at school, was interested in both arts and sciences, and it was more a question of best fit, really. No one within my family is a practicing architect. My father was an accountant. So I didn't really have a great deal of direction, other than it was, as I said, a view that architecture was this sort of unique combination of arts and sciences. And in many ways it was probably only in third year that I really understood or began to understand what architecture was really all about. So in many ways the reason why I started and as it evolved and how I evolved were quite different.
So what would you say your design process is as an architect?
My approach to design is a very rational one. I test various ideas against the objectives that I've set down from understanding the place and from understanding the brief. And I go through a very exhaustive process in trying to match an idea with those requirements.
Hodder Partners being very close to the client. So how important do you think good communication is, or how important do you think being a communicator is to being an architect?
Being a good communicator I think is essential to what we do. But I think that as architects we need to think quite deeply about what we mean by that. I always say that as an architect, one has to be almost multilingual, and the way in which I will communicate to students when I'm teaching, or even the architects in this practice, I communicate in a different way than I do when I'm communicating with a client, or indeed with a local authority, or indeed working with a contractor. As architects we have to be able to communicate in different ways and by different means. If you can't communicate your ideas either to a client in persuading that client that your ideas are actually meeting their brief, if you don't communicate to a contractor who ultimately translates your drawings into built form, then you don't actually achieve success in architecture. So communication is absolutely essential to what we do.
So you're currently the president-elect of the RIBA. How political do you think architecture is right now?
I tend to think about the politicising of architecture in a slightly abstract way, in that because architecture affects people's lives, we have to remember that buildings are for people, and how people experience buildings, how they use buildings, how they live in buildings, how they walk amongst buildings, how they work in buildings. That very nature of architecture is such that it is a political animal. So I've always felt that there is that sort of political aspect of architecture, simply because it affects everyone's lives.
How important do you think it is that a Mancunian is going to be the next president of the RIBA?
I think that very often the RIBA, wrongly in my view, but the RIBA is seen as a London-centric organisation. There are 28,000 members outside of London, and being based in the regions, and being a regionalist, I think has gives out the right message for the Institute in terms of how the Institute wants to connect and engage with members out there.
How do you think architects are going to have to adapt in the future to survive?
What we're seeing, I think, is that being formalised in a much more meaningful way. Historically, majority of projects were the sort of commenced at the outset by, or the instigation of a project was by an architect being approached by a client who wanted to commission a building. Probably approaching 50% of all projects now, the inception is by clients and the commissioning bodies approaching contractors. And many people within the architectural profession have become concerned about that. I'm less concerned about that because I think that as architects we need to see ourselves absolutely embedded within a team. And that whole aspect of collaboration I think is the way in which you produce good architecture, architecture that works.
You maintain strong connections with the Manchester School of Architecture. So what advice would you give students who are studying now?
Probably the biggest piece of advice that I would give a student of architecture today is to recognise that, and which in many ways returns to this issue of collaboration, is actually to recognise that to be a successful architect, it's not about being that genius who produces, the most wonderful, iconic building. There are many, many more aspects to being a successful architect, and very often I find, and it's not necessarily the case in the Manchester School of Architecture, but very often I find that the sort of reluctance to actually engage with the realities of what it is to deliver a building is almost an anathema and some aspects that one shouldn't speak about. So when it comes to the management of resource, whether it be thinking about a program or thinking about the cost or thinking about the engineering or even aspects of business management, these are aspects which I think is changing. But there are aspects of actually delivering successful buildings that sometimes students are very reluctant to engage with. Now that's in part down to the schools of architecture to ignite that awareness. But again, I think if architects are to retain their relevance in producing, good architecture, then when they emerge from schools of architecture and then engage with clients whose resources we are given the responsibility to manage, and you then also engage with the wider construction industry, we have to be capable of actually understanding the implications of that and speaking their language